Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 10. This is the first of two videos for this week. And the goal is to unpack what we encountered in Roland Barthes' text, The Rhetoric of the Image. And then in the second video, I'm going to give you a couple examples for how this sort of system, this methodology, can be employed for contemporary advertisements. And that essentially should give you the basis for the second paper, which you'll be doing this week. There's a lot to cover in this article. As I said, it's a really challenging one. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as I can, but I'm also going to move through the content pretty quickly. So as always, please use the comments, the discussion section on this post for any questions that are left unanswered. And please feel free, if anything's kind of left lingering, to pose questions here. Okay, so this article, as I just said, is written by Roland Barthes, who was a French thinker of the 20th century. He was a semiologist. Now, you may recall from back in like week 2 or something, when we looked at Ferdinand de Saussure, I presented this idea from Saussure, where he said there could be a study of the general system of signs that could exist outside of language and linguistics, and we should call that semiology. Well, Roland Barthes, having been born right around the time that Saussure died, and so being that sort of like a couple generations later, became part of this field of semiology that emerged and became prominent in the middle of the 20th century. And he studied the life of signs. Barthes was also affiliated with what is called the structuralist movement in French thinking, and then later the post-structuralist movement. There's a wide array of thinkers that are associated along these lines, and basically building from Saussure and other linguists, as well as some philologists from the 19th century, the structuralists sought to understand society in general by going to its very foundation, by looking at the structure on which it's built. And then post-structuralists sought to kind of take apart human knowledge to reach a better understanding of the constructs at play. That's a very brief description. But Roland Barthes was mostly a structuralist. He wrote many essays and books. I've taken a few examples to give you a sort of like an overview of some of the themes that he was interested in his work. An early example is the text called Writing Degree Zero. In this book, Roland Barthes posed the question of what would happen if you could reduce language to its core elements, to the very basic essence, to only the essentials. What would it look like if you could remove anything extraneous? What would it look like to reduce language to next to nothing? Another notable book is The Elements of Semiology. You know, he's thinking about questions of signs, signifiers, signified in a very methodical kind of way and providing very in-depth analyses. Mythologies is a collection of short essays, many of which had appeared in popular press, in which he deconstructs the images of society. He talks about a whole wide range of subjects, from different films to wrestling matches to magazine covers. And he questions the ways in which those images create a cultural mythology, how they essentially create the new narratives that we tell ourselves in the modern world. Image, Music, Text is another collection of essays. This one was never actually published in French. And I should note that I've given you 2 dates for each of these publications, if you're scratching your head over that. The first date is the original French publication. Everything Roland Barthes wrote was written in French. The second date is the translation date, when it became accessible to English-speaking audiences. I think it's interesting in this case to sort of show us at which points his ideas reach different parts of the world. Image music text was never published as a volume in French, but it was a collection of essays that had appeared in different sources. This one's particularly notable for us because it is the collection from which Rhetoric of the Image is pulled, although Rhetoric of the Image is an earlier essay written in 1964, if I'm remembering the date correctly. Empire of Signs is a book that Barth wrote following a trip to Japan. On this trip, he came up with the idea that the role of signs and symbols was predominant in Japanese culture. The idea that it's a French man sort of grafting that opinion onto a foreign culture is probably problematic by today's standards, to say the least. There's probably some cultural assumptions at work, though it is still a fascinating study. I'll leave it to you to go check that one out if you're curious about the problematic nature of it. I think it is problematic, but I think it still remains interesting. And I think he was very open to an understanding of different cultures. And then the last book that Roland Barthes wrote is called Camera Lucida. This is an examination of photography and the role that photography plays in shaping memory and how it can serve as a tool for coping with loss and understanding things like death. It's more of a poetic work. It was not intended to be his last, but shortly after completing it, Roland Barthes was struck by a laundry van driving down a street near his home, which killed him. A very sort of tragic end. He was still relatively young, but maybe also poetic that his sort of last work was this contemplation of memory, loss, and death. But that hopefully gives you some sense of the ideas that Roland Barthes was concerned with in his writing. He really was a multifaceted thinker. And his thinking is very much rooted in linguistics. I think it's really important to go back to this core foundational idea that Saussure presents, which not only serves as a basis for part of the thinking in linguistics, but also serves as the premise for semiology, which again, Roland Barthes is deeply involved with. And remember, if we go back to that Saussure reading, we encounter this formulation that you may have thought you were done with, but sorry. Remember, Saussure said that the linguistic sign unites not a thing and a name, but a concept and a sound image. Remember, the elements of the linguistic sign are this idea. Here, the example would be wooden thing growing out of the ground. And then the sound that we apply to that, tree, which form a unit, they form a relationship that's locked in together between that sound tree and the concept of the thing that grows out of the ground, right? And together, those two components are the sign. And remember, he says, I propose to retain the word sign to designate the whole and to replace concept and sound image with signifier and signify. Right, so we have this sign, right? And we have the signifier tree. Sorry, if I did that backwards, we have the signifier tree and the signified wooden thing growing out of the ground, right? So we're keeping that same formulation, sign, signifier, signify. Remember that Saussure is talking about verbal language. This is his primary concern. Well, thinking about this as probably visual thinkers, and we're not the first ones, a question comes up. What role does the sign play in pictorial representation? Whether that's alphabetic, by transcribing the letters T-R-E-E onto a sheet of paper, or whether it's purely visual, whether we see a picture of a tree, where's the sign, the signifier, and the signified? How does that work with respect to images? And this is exactly the starting point for the argument that Roland Barthes is presenting in Rhetoric of the Image. He also wasn't the first one to think of this question. It's actually a question that was going back and forth in one of the linguistics journals to which he was a subscriber and an active contributor. So you have these different linguists and semiologists going back and forth in a sort of public debate about whether or not images can properly be signs, signifiers, and signifieds, and whether or not there is properly a visual language. Roland Barthes felt compelled to contribute to this ongoing dialogue. Thus, he wrote Rhetoric of the Image, and that's what we're stepping into here. It's part of a very specialized discussion amongst linguists and semiologists, and that's why Roland Barthes uses the terminology that he uses. I promise you, if you read anything else that he wrote, it's actually usually much easier to read and kind of much more fun to read for that reason. This is a very specialized debate that he's sort of talking about with other insiders. And that's why he uses the language that he uses. And that's why we have to deal with it, okay? But so he enters in here and he first starts by talking about the idea of an image and what an image does. And he says that the image is an imitation of nature. That's what he's implying by saying that there's this sort of, it goes back to that root imitari. And he calls this analogical representation. It's a one-to-one. The picture fills in for the thing, and they're mostly identical. It's also worth noting that he's juxtaposing this with digital. He's not talking about, a record versus an MP3 when he's talking about analogical versus digital. Analogical is the direct sort of representation of the thing that looks like the thing. The way he's using digital is from a mostly sort of pre-computer world, before the desktop computer, but he means it as a transcription into figures that's separate from the direct one-to-one. So it's the typewritten word is a digital representation, according to Roland Barthes. It's an early sort of point of confusion for many readers. And that's why I'm pointing that one out. That sort of analogical representation is what he's concerned with. And he's asking whether or not that picture can form the same kind of language that written words do. What is the limit of meaning at work here? And is the signification of an image on par with that of the written word? He chooses an advertisement to enter into this on the premise that an advertisement is intentional, right? Advertisers have a very specific message they want to send to you, AKA buy this product, right? That's what an advertisement always says. And the image is always very carefully constructed to promote a certain set of ideas in the potential buyer. There's always a very direct message in an advertisement. It's not an abstract work of art that you're supposed to look at for 2 hours on the wall and contemplate all the different aspects of its meaning. It's supposed to send you a message directly. And for this reason, Roland Barthes chooses an ad which he believes does just that. It's also worth noting that this ad is not selected because of its aesthetic beauty or because it's a particularly great award-winning advertisement or something. It's a totally boring, inconsequential ad. It would be forgotten. Nobody would ever talk about this ad ever again. It's not by an important designer or an important photographer or anything like that. It would be completely forgotten had Roland Barthes not written about it. And he chooses it particularly because it's unremarkable. It's just an ordinary ad that he comes across in day-to-day flipping through a magazine. And when it comes to writing about an ad, which is your paper, you should do just the same thing. Find an ad that's sort of interesting, that might stand out to you, but it doesn't have to be some award-winning ad. And you shouldn't use web resources to sort of hunt down a perfect image. You should ideally flip through a magazine, find something that is somewhat compelling, or at least that you could latch onto, and then go from there. Again, this is certainly not anything extraordinary that Roland Barthes is talking about here. So he looks at the ad, and one of the first sort of observations that he makes, he gets into this idea that there's going to be 3 messages, and that's sort of the underlying framework through which he's going to consider this image. But the first thing that he sort of starts looking at, it's jumbled up with the others, but an important element that emerges is that images are essentially collections of discontinuous signs. There's all these ideas, there's all these sort of signifiers and signifieds floating around on this scene. And some of them have these euphoric values that he talks about. So he says that, as we look at these images, it's not a kind of long string of signs in the way that a spoken sentence is, right? I start my sentence here and I speak until it's finished. That's one straight line of signs, right? Whereas an image moves throughout the entire frame. If there are signs in an image, they come to you piecemeal in this sort of disarray. So we should stop and examine what some of the signs at work in the image are. And he says that right off the bat, you can find 4 signs in this particular ad, right? He says that the scene presents this idea of coming back from the market. There's freshness, there's domestic preparation, and the signifiers for that thing are the half-open bag, the things that need to be unpacked, right? So this idea that it's a set of values, it sort of defies words. But if we have to put a simple word to this first sign, it's freshness or domestic preparation or returning from the market, right? There's a sign implied in looking at this ad. The second sign that he says is at work is the colors at play. Those colors create a form of Italianness, right? Of some reference to Italian culture, which he calls Italianicity, and which we'll look at further in a minute as he does. But the interplay of the different colors that create the tricolored flag, and that implies certain cultural meanings. This is the next sign that he sees, right? The Italianicity of the thing. The third sign that Roland Barthes reads in the message is the objects and the idea that they transmit as a total culinary service, that the entire meal is there for you. Everything is prepared, everything is ready. And then the fourth sign that he reads is the composition itself, saying that it calls to mind the still life or the nature mort. The idea that the framing device used by the photographer is in itself a sign at play in the image. Later in the essay, he talks about the fact that there's all sorts of other signs that we could read into it. The sort of the hall of the plenty, the miracle of the plenty, which is a biblical reference when Jesus ropes in thousands of fish. And there's an endless stream of signs that we might, or maybe not endless, but there's many other signs that we might read into it. But these 4 are sufficient for giving us the basic premise concerning what we're looking at here. And from these signs, we can start to pick apart what the message is going to be. He states that the sort of visual aspect of this scene essentially contains 2 messages. There's a non-coded iconic message, and there's a coded iconic message. We'll come back to those in a minute, because the third message that he talks about is the linguistic message. And this is also the starting point that Roland Barthes uses for approaching this image. So we've got three messages at work. The first is the linguistic message. The other way to put this in the sort of the language of designers, and the sort of to frame it, if you're sort of wondering how it's a linguistic message versus anything else, it's the words, it's the typography, right? There's, in the way that, so Sarah's talking about linguists as something spoken, verbal, it's not really there, but that the next step of transcribing the spoken word is all the type, it's all the actual words that appear in this advertisement. We've got a caption at the bottom of the frame that is in French. So pardon me for reading this in a completely anglicized sort of way, but it's pâté sauce parmesan, pasta sauce parmesan, l'Italian deluxe. It's deluxe Italian products, right? So we have this caption that's immediately telling us what we have here. And then we have additional text or additional linguistic messages and a BIM, as Roland Barthes calls it. And by that, he just means within the image, right? We see the word panzani repeated several times, again, with this pates, the salsa, parmesan. We see these words that appear within the image. So it's appearing on the outside as a caption and on the inside as this particular, as the labels in this case. But any language that appears within the image itself is also a piece of the linguistic message. And first and foremost, the linguistic message serves two purposes. It is denotational and it is connotational. Denotational essentially means that it labels, it describes. Remember, he also uses this when it comes to the image, but it denotes a certain thing. It's the label on the can. That's maybe the sort of, or the on the bags, right? We see Panzani Parmesan. We have this bag in the lower, towards the lower right corner. It's telling you exactly what's inside this packaging, and the same with the little tin of sauce, right? It says salsa panzani, so we know exactly what we're looking at. The text in the lower right corner does mostly the same thing, right? We have pasta sauce and parmesan. It's telling us exactly what's there in a mostly redundant kind of way, right? It says exactly what we're seeing, and in that sense, it's denotational, right? It depicts exactly what's there. Connotational means that it implies something, that it's referencing something beyond what's immediately there, that it's pulling something from our shared cultural knowledge. There's a connotation to what's being said. He also uses this in many forms. He says that it connotes something, right? And again, if something has, you say like, oh, that term has a bad connotation to it. Most of us kind of like understand that as a common day turn of phrase, as something that we hear in our speech. And that's exactly what he means. Things are connotational. They imply some additional meaning. And again, this is where he goes back to the word panzani, right? There's a certain connotation there. It implies, it brings to mind something Italian, right? Now, he says that it's not really actually Italy. It's kind of the cultural assumptions, our own like stereotypes about what Italy is. And that's what he means by Italianicity, right? There's a certain Italianicity to the way that it sounds. This Italianicity is something that we see everywhere, I think, when it comes to food, right? If you've had like ragu or prego tomato sauce, or if you've gotten a DiGiorno pizza lately, guess what? Those are not made by the finest of Italian artisans. Those things are not made anywhere near Italy. There's probably a giant warehouse factory somewhere in Idaho or something where that stuff is cooked up and packaged. So sorry to burst your bubble when you're having your Italian night and you're having your DiGiorno pizza or something. It's not really Italian at all, right? But there's a certain Italianicity to a word like DiGiorno, right? I think we see this with all different food products all the time. We probably also see it with some forms of fashion, with many things that we buy. There's this idea of like an applied cultural resonance to something. And that's what Roland Barthes means by the connotation. And that's where he invents this word Italianicity, right? There's this connotation of it being from Italy, even though we know very well that it's not. And again, when you turn towards your examination of an advertisement, it's fun to think of what the icity at play is. You know, you might find some kind of like Spanish icity, or I don't like a Mexicanicity or something to other foods, if that's what you went towards. Or, you know, again, in fashion, you often see a Frenchicity at play. I'm going to talk about one that has a sort of science-icity or scientific-icity, right? So what is the connotation of something like the language at play? Certainly Panzani is referencing one sort of cultural idea, and there will be connotations to the linguistic message in just about every advertisement. Now, it's also worth noting that every image, according to Roland Barthes, is related to some kind of linguistic message. We live in a verbal, written culture. This flies in the face of what Marshall McLuhan told us, but it's hard to argue with this approach towards images that Roland Barthes presents. If you open a newspaper and you see, you know, sadly, the picture on the newspaper today would probably be a scene of rubble, right? Of a town that's been damaged. And you wouldn't know what it's from if it weren't for either the headline or the caption that tells you about a conflict in Eastern Europe, right? We have some sort of linguistic message that accompanies the image. It's the same when we go to an art museum and we see a painting on the wall that then has a placard that tells us what it's made from and who made it, and probably some of the background for why it was made. These linguistic messages serve as an accompaniment to just about every image we encounter in our society. And Roland Barthes goes so far to say is that we're terrified of not having a linguistic message, that there's a certain horror of encountering an image without that sort of framing device of language. And he's probably right. You know, we typically expect some sort of explanation, even if it's not directly next to it. We usually have some kind of linguistic details to fill in whatever we're looking at. Now, according to this essay of The Rhetoric of the Image, there's two ways that a linguistic message can do that. The first is what he calls anchorage. And this is directly confronting the horror of the unknown, the way that Roland Barthes looks at it, right? We encountered this picture and we don't know what we're seeing, right? We see a bag and vegetables in this case and a red background, but what does it all mean? Well, in the lower right-hand corner, we immediately are told that it's pasta sauce and Parmesan, right? It's totally redundant with what we see, but it anchors us. If we're wondering what's going on, there's something that pulls us back in, holds us in place, and says, this is what you see. If you're wondering what's in these plastic bags within the mesh bag, it is indeed Panzani pasta, right? It's something that, again, the linguistic message is locking us in, it's holding us tight. It's got us on this kind of like leash, or if we're a boat that is adrift in a sea of uncertainty, we can drop anchor and stay in one place. That linguistic message keeps us tethered to a safe spot. And that's what Roland Barthes means by anchorage, right? We're anchored by that message. If we start going off in the distance and wondering what we're looking at, we're immediately anchored by a linguistic message that tells us what we're looking at. You will virtually always see anchorage in the linguistic message of an advertisement. The question is, where is it and what role does it play? Or how does it serve to, what are the sort of key phrases that provide anchorage? Relay does just the opposite and is less commonly seen, especially in advertisements. Roland Barthes says that we mostly see we mostly see relay in films and comic strips, right? We might see an image of somebody in a movie and they tell us about another character, which leads us to the next scene. It takes our mind out of where we are and goes to the next place. Similarly, in a comic strip, there might be reference to something that is not pictured, and just the sort of conflict between what's pictured and what's stated in the linguistic message can be funny onto itself, or it can lead to the next frame of a comic strip. Sometimes you will see relay in advertisements as they sort of allude to bigger ideas that might lie outside of the frame. But typically anchorage is the dominant linguistic function, or the dominant purpose of the linguistic message. There may be sort of bits of relay that you encounter, and think about what they may be. There's not really one in this image. It's not really at play, at least according to Roland Barthes. So those are some of the things that the linguistic message does. And with those in mind, we can start to look at the iconic message or the picture itself. Now, it's worth noting again that these three messages, the linguistic, the non-coded iconic, and the coded iconic messages, are all interspersed. You sort of can't take the linguistic message of the text off of the bag once it's in the picture. It's a piece of the picture. But there's this structuralist reading that Roland Barthes is conducting, where he's going back to the very foundation and trying to pick apart the elements. The first thing, and when we get into the image itself, he starts talking about the non-coded iconic message, which he also, I think the other term for it is the literal message, or it's something along those lines, right? And by this, he means the picture just as it is. If you can look at this with no assumptions, with no beliefs, with only a sort of eye to what is depicted, then you will have a non-coded iconic message. Okay, so there's certain qualities of this that he describes, and I think they're helpful for understanding this. First, it's objective. And this can only be achieved through a photograph, according to Roland Barthes, right? All drawings, all paintings are coded to begin with. There's a certain set of cultural values that the artist employs to create the image. You can never escape that in a painting and drawing. There's always a set of decisions that go into adding lines on the page. There's a certain subjectivity in deciding what you will include and what you won't. There's never been a painter who has sat down and decided first and foremost to sort of get rid of some of the pores on their subject's face, right? You start with the sort of outline and then you add, right? Where a photograph takes everything in front of the camera and records it with no discernment, right? It is, in theory, the subjective eye. There's problems, and there's many photographers who will contest this idea. But the notion that whatever is in front of the camera is immediately recorded is part of what forms the sort of hypothetical non-coded iconic message within the picture. That non-coded message is also innocent. It's just what is there and what happens to be there. There's sort of, there appears to be no decision making. There appears to be no kind of cultural justification. It is just there. And every photograph depicts something that really was just there. It's the nature of the photograph. It has been there. And Roland Barthes talks about that. It is denotational, the non-coded iconic message. It depicts a thing that was there in the real world, just as the way that a word on a pasta bag can sort of be denotational linguistically. So the message in an image can be denotational for the purpose that it tells us tomato, or it tells us onion or can of tomato sauce, right? It simply shows the thing as it was. The non-coded iconic message is also perceptual. It's the thing that we see when we look at the picture. It's the thing that's immediately before us. And that's really how we pick up the non-coded iconic message. Before we think about anything that's there, our eye scans the page and assesses what we see. I like that some people in their responses also talked about this quasi-tautological component of the non-coded message. Tautological is philosophically a circular argument that only proves itself. And that's the idea of this non-coded iconic message. The thing is depicted as there because it was there, and it was there to be depicted as there, and back and forth it goes, round and round forever. It's sort of like this endless cycle that the existence of the thing proves the existence of the thing. And that's kind of what the non-coded iconic message should be. Roland Barthes also says this non-coded iconic message is syntagmatic. This is another linguistics term. It's pointing to the chain of signifiers at work. When you arrange a sentence, you're building a syntagmatic structure. I think a good way to think about this as it relates to an image is imagine take every component of this picture, and those little like refrigerator magnets, each one has one word and you can shuffle them all around. Replace every piece of this picture with one of those magnets and it just says tomato, can of sauce, onion, bag, red background. You can shuffle them all around. And once you have them all in a certain place, you have a syntagmatic formation. You have a very particular arrangement of those words. And that's what we see here. There's a syntagmatic arrangement of elements here. There's a very particular structure. Although it's discontinuous, it doesn't move end to end like a sentence. They fall in particular places in relation to one another. So those are all the elements of the non-coded iconic message, or the ways to understand it. It's there, but it is inseparable from the coded iconic message. They're part and parcel of the same thing, and there's no way they can ever be replaced. And really, the non-coded message is kind of non-existent, right? As soon as you start to scan this page and create your own interpretation, your own assessment, your own reading of the image, you're already incorporating some of the cultural assumptions and values that are required to look at a picture. You can never look at a picture in a purely non-coded sort of way. But it's a very useful exercise to think in these terms because it gives us the toolkit to better interpret what we do see. It provides the basis for the reading of the coded messages. And that's why I think it's actually, as an exercise when it comes time to write your paper, it's a really critical thing to do. Can you go through and assess the non-coded iconic message? Can you look at all of the elements in an objective sort of way and just understand them as sort of building blocks for the image that are neutral, innocent, that are perceptual? How do you describe them without getting into any sort of value judgment? And once you've done that, then you can start looking at the coded iconic message. Then you can look at all the different sort of meanings and ideas that lie within all of those different elements. For Roland Barthes, there's a few descriptors, a few ideas that are associated with the coded iconic message. First, it is cultural. You never see things just objectively. You never see things without some kind of conditioning, without all of your learned experiences going into the image. A tomato is never just sort of like an object. It's either something that comes from a produce aisle or something that comes from a garden, depending on where you're from. It could be something that comes from a particular region or a particular season. All these things sort of form our interpretation of the tomato that we see in the foreground. Something like the red background might have a very powerful effect, given all this sort of different cultural significances of the color red. The coded iconic message is connotational. First and foremost, it connotes all of these things. It represents all these ideas in less of a neutral way. It shows them all with some significance already attached, and it draws on those cultural assumptions. There's a connotation to putting these sort of food products into the bag. There's a connotation to arranging them on a table as if they are spilling out. Nothing's incidental, nothing is just sort of as it was. It's all sort of very, very carefully planned to send a message, to call your mind to outside experiences and references. In that sense, it's also symbolic. And this is where it moves beyond just a sort of sign and signifier. Each thing in this picture does contain a very sort of straightforward relationship to the world, but each thing also calls to mind elements that lie beyond the picture frame, that bring in sort of greater understandings of culture at large. It is therefore ideological. And again, this is something that it's very important to think in these terms to understand the ideology of an image. Remember, last week, Stuart Hall told us that ideologies are those images, concepts, and premises which provide the frameworks through which we represent, interpret, understand, and make sense of social existence, right? That's a pretty good definition of ideology. Roland Barthes approaches it in a slightly different way. And he says that this common domain of signifieds, of connotation, is that of ideology. So both are like a little bit circular when it comes to defining ideology, but the way these pictures, the way that we read these images reflect, represent, help to construct and transform our understanding, our beliefs, our understanding of society, our beliefs, and our value systems. They're informed by those value systems, and they help to reshape those value systems. The image is never free of the belief system with which you come at it. There's always a way that it's shaped by those things. He points to this in the article, and I think that it's a really important aspect of how he recognizes in reading this that he's a French thinker looking at a French advertisement that is referencing Italian culture. And I think he recognizes a shortcoming in there. I know somebody, I'm sorry, I can't recall who, asked if there was a sort of bias or a sort of prejudice in this article. I don't think there is. I think he's talking about the sort of assumptions or the beliefs that go into making the ad and go into how most people read that ad. So if there is a bias or a prejudice, I think he's pointing to one in the bigger French culture at the time towards Italian culture. I don't think he's making that on his own. I think he's pointing to the ideological framework in which the coded iconic message enters into the advertisement and the sort of ideological framework of the advertisement in general. The coded iconic message is also paradigmatic. This is in contrast to the syntagmatic nature of the non-coded message. And again, if we stick with our refrigerator magnet analogy, imagine before you sort of create your little sentence from those magnets, take all of them that are available to you and create like a sort of little system on the fridge that everything else could be constructed from. That's the paradigmatic arrangement. It's all the possibilities based on the sort of culture and the beliefs and based on the semiological system that we're using. So that's the way in which the coded message, it can pull on all these different ideas, right? And in that sense, it's paradigmatic, okay? Because of all these elements, the coded iconic message is ultimately rhetorical. It's a persuasive device used to convince you of a certain set of ideas. It calls to mind all your beliefs and all your values. It has this sort of incredible capacity to take all of your lived experiences and create a judgment just from this little ad, right? And this is a boring advertisement intended to do nothing but to make you go out and buy pasta, right? But in that, Roland Barthes sees this incredible power, this incredible use of rhetoric, all these implied meanings meant to persuade you, meant to shape your value judgments, pulling on your belief systems, rallying you, the way that a politician uses rhetoric to convince you that their position is right. That's what he's saying this advertisement does. That's what he's saying every advertisement does. So he stops short of saying that there is a visual language at work, but he does think that there's a very particular way in which we read images, that they're never totally subjective, that we don't just make of them what we will, that all images, and especially advertising images, bring forth all these kind of cultural assumptions and meanings, all of our ideology to send us a message. And the message that we receive is shaped by all these experiences of our lives. Okay, so again, that's sort of an overview as brief as I could make it. If you have more questions, whether it's about specific terms, about general concepts relating to this article, please post it on the post. Please leave your comments. It's really important to understand this because you're going to use these terms and these ideas to address a contemporary ad. And I'll tell you more about that in part 2. Thanks.